Now call upon the Attorney General and Minister for Economy, Civil Service and Communications, the Honourable Ayaz Said Qayyum, to move his motion. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Sir, Mr. Speaker, for the purpose of Section 145, subsection 1 of the Fijian Constitution, and pursuant to Standing Order 131, I move that Parliament approve A, that the government guarantee the Fiji Airways borrowings consisting of a mix of domestic borrowings up to Fijian $191.1 million and offshore borrowings of up to US $117.1 million, with a total limit of approximately Fijian $455 million, valid for a period of 3 years, effective from 30th May 2020. And that B, the Fiji Airways be exempted from paying a guarantee fee. Thank you, sir.
Is there a seconder?
Honourable Speaker, sir, I beg to second the motion.
I now call upon the Honourable Attorney General and Minister for Economy, Civil Service and Communications to speak on his motion. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Sir, Mr. Speaker, as we discussed early on today, COVID-19, of course, has crippled the global aviation industry with the closure of borders, and of course international flights suspended in most countries. Also domestic flights were also suspended for a period of time. Some have recommenced in the same way that we did. And all airlines, Mr. Speaker, sir, have been struggling financially with massive layoffs, pay cuts, and even some filing for bankruptcy. Mr. Speaker, sir, recognizing the critical role that the airline industry will play in post-COVID-19 economic recovery, in particular for an island nation state like Fiji, it is critically important for us, and also, of course, governments around the world have also provided varying levels of assistance through direct financial injection and sovereign guarantees to national carriers as well as private airlines. I'd like to give some examples in that respect, Mr. Speaker, sir. Globally, the Air France KLM have received US $12 billion grant from the French and Dutch governments. Notwithstanding that, KLM will cut up to 2,000 jobs, and Air France will cut about 5,000 jobs. American Airlines is receiving USD $10.55 billion from the US government bailout scheme. And 39,000 staff have gone on voluntary time off as it assesses in numbers to lay off. Cathay Pacific, US $30.4 million cash grant from the Hong Kong government. And the Hong Kong government will buy 500,000 tickets from all Hong Kong-based airlines. We'll lay off hundreds of cabin crew and other staff, with 433 overseas-based crews to be axed completely. Delta will receive USD $5.4 billion from the US government bailout. The 37,000 staff have gone on unpaid leave. Lufthansa, the governments of Germany, Switzerland, Austria, and Belgium look at a rescue package worth USD $10.8 billion. The airline says it may need to shrink the workforce by 10,000 people. Emirates is cutting the jobs of 30,000 staff, despite the fact that it's been promised cash bailout, and Emirates is looking at raising billions in additional loans. Mr. Speaker, sir, closer to home, of course, Air New Zealand has received USD $900 million or USD $550 million directly from the New Zealand government. Notwithstanding that, they've cut 4,000 jobs, including 1,500 crew members. Air Mauritius, Mr. Speaker, sir, comparable country to ours, has been placed in voluntary administration, and staff have all gone on unpaid leave, where staff cuts on a permanent basis will take place. South African Airways seeking USD $5.11 billion assistance from IMF, World Bank and New Development Bank. All staff have gone on unpaid leave. Virgin Australia, Mr. Speaker, sir, is now in administration, some subsidy from the Australian government for domestic flying only. 1,000 workers to be made redundant, 8,000 to be stood down, awaiting next steps for the administrators that have been appointed. In Qantas, Mr. Speaker, sir, the aviation industry overall will receive Australian $715 million government rescue package, plus Australian government will pay Qantas and Virgin Australia up to Australian $165 million to maintain key domestic flight routes only, not for international. They will stand down 20,000 workers, or 2/3 of its workforce. Mr. Speaker, sir, these are some of the airlines. I've got a whole list of the other airlines that, of course, have been affected. I mean, Virgin Atlantic have requested £500 million of state-backed loans, will eliminate 33% of all their jobs, which is about 3,150 members of their workforce. Mr. Speaker, sir, Fiji Airways is also facing the full brunt of the devastation caused by this pandemic, with its revenues almost zero, and I'll explain why it's almost zero, but profits zero. The operational and financial impact of COVID-19 crisis is unprecedented for the national carrier. Just for the members who may not necessarily remember this, the Fijian government is a majority shareholder in Fiji Airways, owning on 51% of the entire issued share capital. The other shareholders in Fiji Airways are as follows. Qantas owns 46.32% of Fiji Airways. Air New Zealand Limited owns 1.94% of Fiji Airways. The government of Kiribati owns 0.27%. Government of Tonga owns 0.27%. Government of Samoa owns 0.12% or 12%. And the government of Nauru owns 0.08% of Fiji Airways. Despite, Mr. Speaker, sir, earning near zero revenue, Fiji Airways currently has to pay monthly fixed costs of Fijian $38 million. This comprised of aircraft loans and leases of Fijian $20.2 million, employee costs, fixed payments for aircraft maintenance, and other costs totaling $6 million, Mr. Speaker, sir. And as we all know now, that steps have also been taken in respect of arresting some of these costs vis-à-vis the staff cuts that have taken place. Mr. Speaker, sir, in addition to the fixed costs, ongoing flight suspensions and cancellations are contributing towards increased customer refunds. Even if tickets have been sold as non-refundable, Fiji Airways is obliged to refund customers as the service is not being delivered at all. The airline currently operates freight flights, Mr. Speaker, sir, every week to Sydney, Auckland, Los Angeles and Hong Kong, but on a cost of capital recovery basis. In other words, it makes zero profit but has no cash loss. And as we know, Mr. Speaker, sir, Fiji Airways is not a solely freight company, it is a passenger carrier, and the way it makes money is that there are passengers on top and freight at the bottom. Now there's nobody on top, only freight at the bottom, but in order to be able to make these freight flights, slight increase in freight charges have gone up, but they're being subsidized on the freight that comes back. So in other words, what Fiji Airways put simply, in terms of the exports going out of Fiji, 75% of that is fresh agricultural produce going to Sydney, New Zealand, LA. Garments are 14%, kava is 6%, seafood is 3%, and other commodities. Mr. Speaker, sir, these freight flights are critically important for us. It keeps the supply chain open. So when we have the freight going from Fiji, they charge a lower price to our exporters. And coming back, those that we are importing is a slightly higher price. Simply pays for the fuel, pays for the crew, and that's it. Mr. Speaker, sir, of course, until this morning, despite the zero revenues for the past number of months, Fiji Airways has kept its staff employed, albeit with a 35% reduction in the salaries of the executives and 30% reduction for other staff. In other words, all the staff that have not been working for the past 2 months have been paid 70% of the salaries. Mr. Speaker, sir, of course, this cannot continue. Mr. Speaker, sir, the guarantee that we are seeking are for a number of sources of funding that we'll be ascertaining. And I'd like to highlight them now, Mr. Speaker, sir. FNPF is providing a loan of $53.6 million. The Reserve Bank of Fiji, through the Export Finance Facility loan, will lend $75 million to the Fiji Development Bank, which will then on-lend to Fiji Airways, because RBF cannot do direct lending, at a rate of 3%. So FDB will have the opportunity to make some money with the 2% margin that they will charge. ANZ is freeing up, and through a bank letter of credit, we're getting $52 million from ANZ. Bread Bank, through a letter of credit, getting $10.5 million. DAE Capital, which is the 9-month rental deferral of the two A350s of $20.2 million. US. Avalon, 9 months rental deferral of the A330-300s of $10.1 million. GCAS, which is the 9-month rental deferral of the 2 Boeing MAX 8s, which actually are flying, as you know, Mr. Speaker, sir, because of the aviation, the problems with the MAXs, $8.9 million. And the KfW IPAX Bank Export Credit Agency, or HELABA, the 12-month repayment deferral of the MAX 8s also, which is $22.2 million. And for the first time, Mr. Speaker, sir, the ADB private sector arm will be lending to a private company, essentially Fiji Airways, into the aviation sector, which is US $50 million. And IATA is 25% of forward sales in lieu of the refunds, which is $5.6 million. I also would like to hasten to add, Mr. Speaker, sir, that the ADB drawdown will not take place unless and until the situation prolongs into next year. So it's more of a contingency fund. As highlighted, Mr. Speaker, sir, that these fundings are from domestic and also offshore borrowing. The majority of the facilities proposed to be guaranteed for offshore borrowings in the form of explicit guarantee for the deferral of the lease rental payments, as I've highlighted, Mr. Speaker, sir. Mr. Speaker, sir, if the support is not provided to Fiji Airways, sorry, 1 second. Mr. Speaker, sir, of course, with these guarantees, if Fiji Airways does not make the repayments, then of course government will be liable as for all guarantees. Mr. Speaker, sir, I'd like to highlight what is the current government exposure as far as government guarantees are concerned, which I'm legally obliged to do so. As of April 2020, government guaranteed debt to government-related entities amounted to $674 million, or 55.9% of GDP. Subject to the approval of this guarantee, Mr. Speaker, sir, the additional guarantee of $455 million to Fiji Airways will increase the total guaranteed exposure to $1.13 billion, or 9.8% of GDP. Mr. Speaker, sir, of course, Fiji Airways needs to be protected. We need to ensure it survives because it is critically important for the revival of the Fijian economy. And therefore, it is critically important, Mr. Speaker, sir, that this Parliament unanimously supports this guarantee that we've managed to put together, Mr. Speaker, sir, through all the different financing agencies. The difference, of course, of what we are doing and what, as I read out, some of the other governments are doing, is that the other governments have from government revenue, from government sources, funded directly money into these airlines. What we managed to do in the past number of weeks, talk to a number of multiple stakeholders, being able to get them to the party, get them to agree, and they're willing to lend to Fiji Airways, defer the repayments based on government guarantees. So there's no funding directly coming through our budgetary provision, which means we have far more money in that respect by saving the money to be able to spend on other measures, including things like unemployment benefits. Mr. Speaker, sir, of course, Fiji Airways, are needless to remind the Parliament that it provides a very critical role in respect of foreign reserves. Because Fiji Airways brings in foreign reserves for us. And of course, Mr. Speaker, sir, it will have long-term implications on unemployment if you don't protect your national carrier. Because we are so heavily dependent on tourism, which is about 40% of our GDP. And over 90% of all tourism arrivals into Fiji come on an airline, of which over 70% now come on Fiji Airways. Mr. Speaker, sir, what we have also discussed with Fiji Airways, that they need to be in a strong financial position. If we're able to give them the financial security now, we'll be able to then ensure that Fiji Airways bounces back really quickly. Part of this, Mr. Speaker, sir, also that I'd like to mention is Fiji Airways has this aviation academy. As also has been announced today, that all the expatriate pilots, their contracts have all been terminated. In fact, they terminated some time back. And most of the Fijian pilots, except for 5, will be retaining their jobs. But we need them, and they'll be trained through the Fiji Aviation Academy that now exists in Namaka in Nadi. Because as we know that if a pilot stops flying, the ability for them to get back and fly a real plane actually is much longer, it's 6 to 9 months. So we need to have the pilots to be able to be continuously trained. So the moment we get some good news on the travel bubble or any other type of good news in respect of international travel, they'll be ready and willing to fly our aircraft. Mr. Speaker, sir, we of course, as we said, we are working on the travel bubble and we are looking at some other options regarding that. With those introductory remarks, Mr. Speaker, sir, I'd like to urge Parliament to support this guarantee that will ensure that our national carrier, which is important for our economy, survives through these very trying times and come out on top of it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, sir.
I thank the Honourable Attorney General and Minister for Economy for his motion.